It was a peaceful afternoon in town. The sun was shining, and the streets were quiet. Birds were chirping in the trees, and a soft breeze moved the leaves. People walked along the sidewalks, talking and laughing. Everyone was busy with their own lives. Among them was a woman named Claire Walker. She was 29 years old and had short brown hair. She had a kind smile and walked with steady steps, moving confidently along the sidewalk. But unlike most people, she couldn't see the world around her. Claire was blind. By her side was her guide dog, Shadow. He was a strong black Labrador with sharp ears and a sleek coat. His eyes were always watching, always ready. Shadow was not just a pet, he was Claire's protector, her partner, and her eyes. Most people who saw Claire felt sorry for her. "Oh, that poor woman," they would whisper. "She must have such a hard time." Some would even try to help when she didn't need it. "Ma'am, do you need help crossing the street?" a man once asked. Claire had smiled and shaken her head. "No, thank you. Shadow takes good care of me." And that was the truth. Shadow was more than just a guide dog. He was smart, strong, and loyal. He could sense danger before it even arrived. But no one knew the real truth about him. Shadow wasn't just any guide dog. He had a past. A past that most wouldn't believe. And today, some bikers were about to learn that lesson the hard way. Claire had lived in this town for many years. She knew every street, every store, and every corner. Even though she couldn't see, she could picture the world around her in her mind. She knew the sound of the bakery's doorbell and the smell of fresh bread floating through the air. She knew the feel of the sidewalk under her feet and the familiar voices of the people who worked at the shops. Every day, Claire followed the same routine. She would wake up early, brush her hair, and put on comfortable clothes. Then, she would prepare Shadow's harness and leash. "Ready for our walk, boy," she would say. Shadow would wag his tail, standing tall and alert. He knew his job. He knew he had to keep Claire safe. Together, they would walk to the grocery store, the coffee shop, or sometimes just around the park. Today, Claire needed to buy some groceries. She held onto Shadow's harness and walked down the street, feeling the warm sun on her skin. People stepped aside as she walked, giving her space. Some smiled at her. Some said hello. She always smiled back. "Good afternoon, Claire," called Mrs. Thompson, the kind lady who owned the flower shop. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," Claire replied. She could hear the soft rustling of flower petals as the woman arranged her bouquets. She could even smell the fresh roses and daisies from where she stood. Shadow kept moving, leading her down the sidewalk. He knew their path by heart. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed peaceful. But that peace wouldn't last for long. Claire was only a few blocks away from the grocery store when she heard it. The deep, rumbling growl of motorcycle engines. It wasn't just one or two bikes, it was several. The engines were loud, shaking the air around her as they got closer. Claire had heard motorcycles before, but something about these made her feel uneasy. Shadow felt it too. She could tell by the way his body tensed up slightly. He wasn't scared. Shadow was never scared. But he was alert. The motorcycles roared as they slowed down. The sound of tires rolling against the pavement stopped near her. Then, silence. Claire kept walking, pretending not to notice. She had learned a long time ago that ignoring trouble was sometimes the best way to avoid it. But then, a voice. "Hey, look at this," a man said, his voice rough and amused. "Blind girl walking all alone." Another man chuckled. "Think she even knows we're here?" Claire felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard voices like this before, mocking, cruel, and full of trouble. Shadow let out a low breath, his body still. Claire kept walking, But the men weren't done. One of them spoke again, his voice getting closer. "Hey, sweetheart, where you headed? Need a ride?" Laughter followed. Claire gripped Shadow's leash tighter. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let them hear her fear. She took a slow breath. "No, thank you," she said calmly. But the men didn't leave. She could hear them moving now, boots scraping against the pavement. They were circling her. Shadow's ears twitched. His muscles were tight. Claire didn't need to see to know what was happening. She had been in situations like this before. She could feel the danger in the air, the way the laughter turned into something mean. One of the men whistled. "Nice dog you got there," he said. Claire knew what was coming next. She could hear it in their tone. They thought she was weak. They thought they could scare her. One of them stepped closer. She felt a shadow fall over her. Then, fingers brushed against her arm. Before he could do more, Shadow moved. A low growl rumbled in his throat, deep and strong. It wasn't just any growl. It was a warning. The laughter stopped. "Whoa, what's wrong with your dog?" one of the men muttered. Claire let a small smile creep onto her lips. "Oh, don't mind Shadow," she said softly. "He just doesn't like bullies." One of the men scoffed. "Yeah? What's a mutt like that gonna do?" Shadow didn't bark. He didn't snap. He didn't move. But Claire knew she could feel it. He was waiting. Waiting for the moment. Waiting for them to make a mistake. Because Shadow wasn't just any dog. And these men? They were about to learn that the hard way. Claire stood still, listening closely. She could hear the rough breathing of the man who had just touched her arm. She could hear the faint creak of leather jackets and the shifting of heavy boots on the pavement. The air smelled of gasoline and cigarette smoke, mixing with the fresh scent of the flowers from the shop nearby. Shadow remained still, but Claire could feel his energy changing. His body was tense, his head slightly lowered. He wasn't afraid. No, Shadow was waiting, watching. He had been trained for moments like this. The man in front of her chuckled, but there was hesitation in his voice. He had heard Shadow's growl. "What's wrong, lady?" he said, forcing another laugh. "We're just being friendly." Claire kept her face calm, but her grip on Shadow's leash tightened. She knew exactly what was happening. These men weren't just teasing her. They were testing her. Seeing how much they could get away with. She had met men like this before. They thought she was weak. They thought she couldn't fight back. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Another man stepped closer, his boots scraping the pavement. "Blind and alone," he muttered. "Must be scary, huh? Just you and your little dog." Claire smiled slightly. "Oh, I'm not scared," she said softly. "But maybe you should be." The men laughed again, but it was different this time. Less confident. More confused. One of them nudged the leader. "Come on, man. Let's just go." The leader scoffed. "Relax. It's just a dog." Claire turned her head slightly in his direction. "Not just a dog," she said. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she gave a command. "Shadow, stand." Instantly, Shadow moved. His posture changed in an instant. His calm, relaxed stance shifted into something powerful. His muscles tensed, his ears pinned back, his head slightly lowered. The men noticed. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. Shadow let out another low growl, this time louder, deeper. It rumbled like thunder. It was a warning. The leader took a step back. Claire heard it. The slight shuffle of his boots against the ground. That's right. Step back. But then, one of the men made a mistake. He reached for Claire again. It was the last thing he should have done. Shadow exploded into action. With a sudden burst of speed, he leaped forward, jaws snapping. He didn't bite, no, not yet. But he lunged so fast and with such force that the man stumbled back, nearly falling. Whoa! What the hell, he shouted, hands raised. The other bikers backed up too, their confidence suddenly gone. Claire reached down and placed her hand on Shadow's head. Easy, boy, she murmured. Shadow stopped, his body still tight with energy, but he didn't advance again. He just stood there, muscles coiled, waiting for her next command. Claire tilted her head slightly. I told you. Shadow doesn't like bullies. The men were silent now. Shadow wasn't barking. He wasn't growling anymore. But somehow, that was even worse. Because he wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The leader of the bikers swallowed hard. Claire could hear it, the small gulp in his throat. Let's go, one of the men whispered. The leader hesitated for just a moment longer. Then he let out a sharp breath. Yeah, he muttered. Whatever. They turned, boots crunching against the pavement as they walked away. A few of them glanced back at Shadow, who hadn't moved an inch. And then, just like that, the roar of motorcycles filled the air again. Engines rumbled, tires screeched against the pavement, and within seconds, they were gone. Claire waited, listening carefully until the sound faded completely. Then, slowly, she exhaled. She reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. Good boy, she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, letting out a small huff as if to say, that was easy. Claire smiled. She didn't need to see to know what had just happened. She had won. Again. A small voice spoke up from behind her. Excuse me, ma'am. Claire turned her head toward the voice. It was a young boy. She could tell by the sound of his voice maybe 10 or 11 years old. That was so cool, the boy said. Your dog is awesome. Claire grinned. Yeah. He is. The boy hesitated. Is he really, just a guide dog? Claire paused for a moment. Then she leaned down slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. Shadow is a retired Navy SEAL K9, she said softly. The boy gasped. No way, he whispered. Claire just smiled. Way. And with that, she straightened up, patted Shadow's back, and continued walking. Behind her, she could still hear the boy's excited whispers. Did you hear that? Her dog was in the Navy. That's like, a superhero dog. Claire chuckled. She could imagine the look on the kid's face, wide-eyed and amazed. Shadow kept walking beside her, as calm as ever. To anyone else, he was just a regular guide dog. But Claire knew better. And now, those bikers did too. As she reached the grocery store, Claire pushed open the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of fresh bread and spices filled the air. The cashier, a friendly woman named Linda, greeted her. Hey there, Claire. How's your day been? Claire smiled. Oh, just the usual, she said. She reached down, running her fingers through Shadow's fur. Nothing too exciting. Shadow let out a quiet huff almost like a laugh. And together, they walked forward, ready for whatever came next. Claire had just finished her grocery shopping. The bag in her hand wasn't too heavy, just a few things she needed for the week. She liked coming to the store because it was familiar. She knew where everything was, and the workers were always friendly. Some of them even knew her by name. She walked through the automatic doors, feeling the warm afternoon air on her face. Shadow, her loyal guide dog, stood by her side, calm and steady. He was more than just her eyes, he was her protector, her friend. With her cane folded away, she let Shadow lead her across the parking lot. She trusted him completely. His paws tapped against the pavement, guiding her safely past cars and curbs. Then, she heard it. A low chuckle. It was the kind of laugh that made her skin prickle. The kind of laugh that wasn't friendly. Then came another sound, a deep, steady rumble of motorcycle engines. Claire slowed her steps. She tilted her head slightly, listening. The engines weren't moving. They were just idling. Waiting. Then boots. Heavy boots, crunching against the pavement. She wasn't alone anymore. A voice spoke, rough and mocking. "Look at this," the man sneered. "Blind girl all alone. Think she even knows we're here?" Another voice laughed. "Hey sweetheart, where ya headed? Need a ride?" Claire gripped Shadow's leash a little tighter. She wasn't afraid. No, fear wasn't the right word. She was aware. She could feel the shift in Shadow's body. His muscles were tense, his breathing steady but alert. He wasn't scared either. But he was ready. Claire had learned to trust that feeling. Because when Shadow reacted like this, it meant trouble. And these men? They had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to face. She kept walking, acting like she hadn't heard them. Sometimes, ignoring people was the best way to make them lose interest. But these men weren't going to let her go that easily. Another set of footsteps. Closer this time. "Hey, sweetheart," the second man repeated, his voice even louder. "We're talking to you." Claire stopped walking. She took a slow breath, keeping her face calm. She had been in situations like this before. She knew how these kinds of men worked. They weren't interested in being helpful. They were interested in power. And they thought she had none. She turned her head slightly in their direction. "I don't need any help," she said, her voice smooth but firm. "I'm just heading home." The first man let out a short laugh. "Home, huh," he said. "That's cute. You live around here?" Claire didn't answer. She knew better than to give them any personal information. She took another step forward. Shadow moved with her, his body still tense. But one of the men stepped in front of her, blocking her path. She could hear the shift of his jacket, the quiet jingle of keys hanging from his belt. "Where ya rushin' off to?" he asked. Claire clenched her jaw. This wasn't just teasing anymore. This was a trap. Shadow let out a quiet huff. It wasn't a growl, not yet. But it was a warning. The men laughed again. "What's wrong, girl?" one of them taunted. "Your little dog gonna protect you." Claire smiled slightly. Oh, if only they knew. She didn't need to see their faces to know what they looked like. She had met men like them before. The kind who thought strength was about size, about numbers. The kind who mistook silence for weakness. She could hear them shifting, their movements uncertain now. They weren't afraid. Not yet. But they would be. "Tell you what," the leader said, his voice dripping with amusement. "How about we walk you home? Make sure you don't get lost." Claire took another step forward, but again, they moved to block her. Shadow's leash was tight in her hand, but not because she was holding him back. It was because he was holding himself back. She could feel it in the way his muscles twitched under her fingers, the way his breathing had slowed. Shadow was waiting. Waiting for her signal. Waiting for the moment she needed him. Claire tilted her head, pretending to think about their offer. Then she smiled again. "That's really kind of you," she said, her voice soft and polite. "But I don't think you want to do that." The men chuckled. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Claire reached down and patted Shadow's head. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke a single word. "Stand." Instantly, Shadow moved. His entire body shifted in a blink. His calm, guide dog stance disappeared. His muscles tightened, his ears pinned back, his head lowered slightly. It was a stance Claire knew well. It was the stance of a trained warrior. The laughter stopped. "What the hell?" one of the men muttered. Shadow let out a low, deep growl. It was the kind of sound that didn't just come from a dog. It came from a predator. Claire could almost hear the change in their breathing. The sudden, sharp intake of air. They were starting to understand. But it was already too late. The leader cleared his throat. "Relax, lady. We were just messin' around." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "Yeah," the man muttered. "Didn't mean nothin' by it." Shadow didn't move. His growl rumbled in his throat, deep and steady. The second man took a step back. "Hey, man, let's just go," he muttered. "Something's not right about this." The leader hesitated. Claire could tell he was trying to hold on to whatever power he thought he had left. But Shadow hadn't even moved yet. He hadn't lunged. He hadn't barked. And yet, they were already backing away. Claire smiled. "Smart choice," she said. The leader scoffed, but it was weak. "Whatever," he muttered. "Kman, let's get outta here." They turned, boots scuffing against the pavement. A moment later, engines roared to life. Claire stood still, listening as the motorcycles sped away. Only when the sound had completely faded did she finally exhale. She reached down, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Good boy," she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, letting out a soft huff. If dogs could smirk, Claire was sure he would be smirking right now. She gave him one last pat before adjusting the grocery bag in her hand. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she started walking again. Because she may have been blind. But she wasn't helpless. And now, those bikers knew it too. Claire took a deep breath and continued walking. Her heart was still beating a little fast, but not because she was scared. No, she had been in situations like this before. People always underestimated her. They saw a blind woman and thought she was weak. They thought she needed protection. They thought she was an easy target. But they never expected Shadow. She smiled slightly as she walked down the quiet sidewalk. The breeze was cool, carrying the scent of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. It was comforting. Familiar. A reminder that the world wasn't all bad. There were kind people too. As she moved, she listened closely. Footsteps. Conversations. The hum of traffic in the distance. Every sound helped her map out her surroundings. She didn't need to see, she could hear everything. She could feel the world around her in ways that most people never could. Shadow walked beside her, calm as ever, but she could still feel the slight tension in his body. He was still on alert. Even though the bikers had left, he hadn't fully relaxed. She reached down and gently ran her fingers through his fur. "It's okay, boy," she whispered. "They're gone." Shadow let out a small huff, but he didn't fully relax. Claire knew why. She knew those types of men. Sometimes, they didn't give up so easily. She decided to take a different route home, just in case. Instead of going straight down the main street, she turned left, heading toward the park. It was a longer walk, but she didn't mind. The park was peaceful. Safe. There were always families there, kids playing, old couples sitting on benches, enjoying the fresh air. She walked slowly, listening to the soft rustling of leaves above her. Birds chirped in the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed. Shadow's pace matched hers perfectly, his step steady and strong. He knew the way. He had memorized every turn, every path. But then, a sound. Claire froze. It was faint, but she knew it too well. the deep, distant growl of motorcycle engines. Her heart skipped a beat. Shadow's ears perked up. His body tensed again. They were following her. Claire's mind raced. What did they want? Were they just trying to scare her? Or were they planning something worse? She took a slow breath, keeping her face calm. Panicking wouldn't help. She had to think. She listened again. The engines were getting closer, but not too close. They weren't speeding toward her. They were hanging back. Watching. They were testing her. Shadow let out a low growl. It was quiet, almost too soft to hear. But Claire heard it. She tightened her grip on his leash. Not yet, she murmured. She kept walking. The park entrance was just ahead. If she could make it there, she'd be safer. There would be people around. Witnesses. She quickened her pace. Shadow moved with her, matching her stride perfectly. He was ready. The engines grew louder. The sound of tires rolling over pavement sent a chill down her spine. Then, a sharp whistle. She recognized it instantly. It was the same sound one of the bikers had made earlier. A signal. A call. They weren't done with her. Claire clenched her jaw. Fine. If they wanted to follow her, let them. They had no idea what they were walking into. She reached the park entrance and stepped inside. The moment her feet hit the soft grass, she felt safer. She could hear kids playing on the swings, dogs barking in the distance, people chatting. She wasn't alone anymore. She slowed her pace and took a deep breath. Shadow's ears twitched, still listening. She found a nearby bench and sat down, pretending to rest. But she was listening. She was waiting. And then, footsteps. They weren't close. Not yet. But she could hear them. Heavy boots crunching against the gravel path. The bikers had followed her inside. She could feel it now. The way the air changed. The way Shadow's body stiffened. They were watching her. Claire stayed still, running her fingers over Shadow's head. Then, a voice. Hey there, sweetheart. The same voice from before. Slow. Taunting. They hadn't left. They hadn't given up. Claire turned her head slightly, pretending to be surprised. Oh, she said softly. It's you again. The man laughed. Didn't think we'd see you again so soon, he said. Small world, huh? Claire didn't answer. She just stroked Shadow's fur. The man took a step closer. You know, he continued, you really shouldn't be out here alone. The world's a dangerous place. Shadow's muscles tightened. Claire smiled slightly. I'm not alone. The man chuckled. Oh yeah. He nodded toward Shadow. You mean your little dog? Claire tilted her head. Little. The man smirked. What? You think he's scary? Claire took a deep breath. Then, in a calm voice, she spoke a single word. Protect. Shadow moved. It happened so fast, the man barely had time to react. One moment, Shadow was sitting quietly by her side. The next, he had lunged. Not biting. Not attacking. But warning. His sharp teeth bared. His growl deep and powerful. The man stumbled back, nearly tripping over himself. Whoa! What the? Shadow didn't stop. He stood firm, ears back, eyes locked onto the man. This wasn't just a growl. This was a trained soldier ready to strike. The other bikers hesitated. Dude, one of them muttered. That's not just a guide dog. Claire finally stood. She faced them, her expression calm. You're right, she said. He's not. The leader swallowed hard. Okay, he muttered. He forced a laugh, but it was shaky now. Relax. No need to get crazy. Claire smiled. Oh, I'm not worried. She reached down, resting a hand on Shadow's back. But maybe you should be. The leader clenched his jaw, looking at Shadow, then at Claire. Then, finally, he muttered, let's go. The group turned, their footsteps hurried. Within seconds, they were gone. Claire let out a slow breath. She knelt down beside Shadow, scratching behind his ears. Good boy, she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, his body relaxing. Claire stood again and took a deep breath. She could still hear the normal sounds of the park. Laughter. Conversations. Life moving on. The world wasn't all bad. She adjusted her grip on Shadow's leash. And then, without another word, she walked forward, ready for whatever came next. Because she may have been blind. But she would never be helpless. And now? Those bikers knew it too. The 5 men surrounded Claire, their heavy boots scraping against the pavement. Their movements were slow, deliberate. They weren't rushing. No, they were taking their time, enjoying the moment, like a group of wolves circling their prey. Claire could hear their steps, could feel the air shift as they moved closer. The smell of leather and cigarette smoke filled her nose. Then, one of them reached out. His fingers barely brushed against her arm. That was all it took. Before he could react, Shadow moved. A low, deep growl rumbled from his throat. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. It wasn't just a warning, it was a promise. The laughter stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The man who had reached for Claire took a step back, his breath hitching. Whoa, what's wrong with your dog? He muttered. His voice wasn't mocking anymore. Claire smirked. Oh, don't mind Shadow, she said, her tone calm. He just doesn't like bullies. Silence. Then, the leader of the group scoffed. His voice was full of fake confidence. Yeah, he said, stepping forward. What's a mutt like that gonna do? Shadow didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He just stood there, muscles coiled, every inch of him tense like a spring ready to snap. His ears were pinned back, his stance firm. Claire knew this posture. She had felt it before. It meant one thing. The second they made a move, he would strike. The air was thick with tension. The men weren't laughing anymore. Claire could hear the uncertainty in their breathing. They weren't sure what to do. One of them, the youngest sounding of the group, shuffled his feet. Maybe we should just leave, he muttered. The leader turned to him, his voice sharp. Shut up. The young man fell silent, but Claire could sense his hesitation. Good. Not all of them were stupid. The leader wasn't done. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You think that dog's gonna stop us? Claire smiled. A small, knowing smile. Oh, I don't think, she said softly. I know. The leader hesitated for just a second. A second too long. Because Shadow took that moment to act. He lunged not at the leader, not yet. No, he moved with precision, his instincts sharp as ever. He snapped his teeth just inches from the man's arm, a quick, powerful motion. A warning. The leader flinched, stumbling back. For the first time, there was real fear in his voice. What the hell? The others backed up too. Dude, that's not a normal dog, one of them whispered. Claire tilted her head slightly, her fingers resting lightly on Shadow's back. She could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath. He was in control. He was waiting for her next move. She took a slow breath. You really should leave now, she said. Her voice was quiet, but firm. The leader hesitated. Claire could hear his breathing uneven, uncertain. He was trying to decide. But Claire already knew the answer. They weren't brave. They were cowards who liked picking on people they thought were weaker. And now that they weren't in control, they didn't know what to do. One of the men, the one who had touched her, finally broke. "Forget this," he muttered. "I'm out." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching against the pavement. The others looked at each other. One by one, they followed. Only the leader remained. Claire listened to his breathing. He was angry. Embarrassed. He wanted to do something, say something. But he didn't. Because Shadow was still watching him. Still waiting. And the leader knew if he made one wrong move, Shadow would not hesitate. Finally, he let out a frustrated grunt and spat on the ground. "Whatever," he muttered. "Crazy blind chick." And then he turned and stomped away. Claire stood still, listening as their footsteps faded. Only when she was sure they were gone did she relax her grip on Shadow's leash. She knelt down, running her fingers through his fur. "Good boy," she murmured. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, letting out a quiet huff. If dogs could smirk, Claire was sure he was smirking now. She stood up, took a deep breath, and continued walking. Because she may have been blind. But she was never, ever helpless. And now? Those men knew it too. Claire stood still for a moment, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a car engine hummed before fading into silence. The world had gone back to normal. As if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The bikers had left, their laughter and arrogance replaced by uncertainty and fear. They thought they were strong. They thought they were in control. But they had learned something tonight. They had learned that Claire was not weak. And they had learned that Shadow was not just a dog. She reached down, her fingers brushing against Shadow's fur. He was still tense, still alert, still ready. But she knew he wouldn't need to act again. Not tonight. She gave him a small pat. "Come on, boy," she murmured. "Let's go home." Shadow let out a short breath, as if agreeing, and they started walking. The streets were quiet now. The town was small, and most people had already gone inside for the night. The warm glow of streetlights lit the sidewalk, casting soft shadows. Claire knew the way home. Every step was familiar. But she also knew she wasn't completely safe yet. She listened carefully, every sense on high alert. The bikers had left, but that didn't mean they wouldn't come back. Shadow walked beside her, his steps steady, his ears twitching at every sound. He was listening too. Claire's mind replayed what had happened just minutes ago. The way they had circled her. The way they had tried to touch her. The way Shadow had stopped them. She smiled slightly. They had no idea just how lucky they were. Most people thought guide dogs were just that, guides. Helpers. Trained to lead the blind, to navigate busy streets, to avoid obstacles. And they were. But Shadow was different. Shadow had a past. A past that very few knew about. He wasn't just any guide dog. He had once been a warrior. A fighter. A Navy SEAL K9. Claire had known his history from the moment she got him. She had heard the stories, read the reports. Shadow had been trained for combat. He had worked alongside some of the toughest soldiers in the world. He had seen things that most people couldn't imagine. And then, when his service was over, when his body was no longer needed for war, he had been placed in the guide dog program. Most people didn't know. Most people just saw a calm, gentle Labrador walking beside a blind woman. But Claire knew. And now, so did those bikers. She turned down a quiet street, her apartment just a few blocks away now. But then. A sound. A distant hum. Motorcycles. Her stomach tightened. They were back. She didn't stop walking. Didn't panic. But she did prepare. Shadow's ears twitched. His body stiffened. He had heard them too. Claire kept her steps even, her pace steady. She didn't want to show fear. But she wasn't stupid. If they had come back, it wasn't just to scare her. They wanted something. And Claire had a feeling she knew what. Revenge. They had been humiliated. Made to look weak. Men like them didn't like that. The rumble of the engines grew louder. Then tires screeched. Engines cut off. Silence. Claire stopped walking. She could feel them. Watching. Waiting. She let out a slow breath. Then, footsteps. Boots. Heavy. Slow. They were coming. Shadow's muscles tensed. His head lowered slightly. His tail went stiff. Claire could feel his energy shift. He was waiting for her signal. The leader's voice broke the silence. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" he sneered. Claire tilted her head slightly. "I don't know what you mean." A sharp laugh. "Yeah, you do." More footsteps. More shifting. They had her surrounded. Again. But this time, she wasn't playing their game. This time, she wasn't going to wait. She reached down, gripping Shadow's harness. And then, in a voice as cold as steel, she gave the command. "Shadow. Engage." It happened in an instant. One moment, Shadow was still. The next, he exploded into motion. He lunged fast, powerful, precise. The leader barely had time to react before Shadow had him on the ground. The man let out a choked gasp as Shadow's weight pinned him down, his sharp teeth inches from his throat. The others froze. Holy! Shadow didn't bite. But he could have. And they knew it. The leader's breath was ragged, panicked. "Get him off me," he wheezed. Claire took a slow step forward. "I told you," she said softly. "Shadow doesn't like bullies." Silence. Nobody moved. Shadow held his position, his deep growl vibrating in the air. Then, finally Claire gave the second command. "Release." Shadow backed off immediately, stepping away, but his eyes never left the leader. The man scrambled to his feet, gasping for air. His hands trembled as he wiped at his face. The others were dead silent. Then without a word, they turned and ran. Not walked. Ran. Engines roared to life. Tires screeched. And then they were gone. Claire let out a slow breath. She knelt down, running her hands through Shadow's fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, but he was still watching. Still listening. Claire smiled. They wouldn't be back. Not now. Not ever. She stood, adjusting her grip on his leash. "Come on, boy," she said softly. "Let's go home." They walked in silence, the quiet night settling around them. The wind was calm. The stars above were bright. And for the first time that evening, Claire felt truly at peace. Because tonight, justice had been served. And Shadow? Shadow had reminded the world exactly who he was. Not just a guide dog. Not just a companion. But a warrior. And anyone who dared to threaten Claire would learn that lesson the hard way. The leader of the bikers stepped even closer, his heavy boots crunching against the pavement. Claire could hear the slow, deliberate way he moved, as if trying to make her nervous. But Claire wasn't nervous. She had been in this kind of situation before. She knew how men like him thought. They believed that strength was about size, about numbers. They believed that because she was blind, she was weak. They had no idea how wrong they were. "You don't want to do this," Claire warned, tilting her head slightly in his direction. Her voice was calm, steady. The leader laughed, a low, mean sound. "Oh yeah," he taunted. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Claire smiled. "It's not me you should be worried about." The leader snorted. "Oh yeah? You mean your little mutt?" Claire's smile didn't fade. Then, with a sharp whistle, she gave the command. One single word. "Shadow. Engage." Everything happened in a blink. 1 second, Shadow was still. The next, he was airborne. His body moved like lightning, his muscles exploding with power. Before the leader even realized what was happening, Shadow's jaws had clamped down onto his arm, his powerful bite locking in place. The man let out a scream, stumbling backward. His knees buckled, and in seconds, Shadow twisted him down to the ground. The impact was heavy. The leader gasped as he hit the pavement, his breath coming in sharp, ragged bursts. The other bikers froze. They hadn't even had time to react. Shadow stood over the leader, his teeth still bared, his body positioned like a predator ready to strike again. His growl was low, steady, vibrating through the air. The leader trembled beneath him. Get him off me," he wheezed, his voice shaking. The other bikers scrambled back. Their boots scraped against the pavement as they tried to decide whether to help or run. Claire took a slow step forward, her face unreadable. She tilted her head slightly. "Shadow, release." Immediately, Shadow obeyed. He let go of the man's arm but didn't back away. His eyes were locked onto the leader, his body still tense. Waiting. Daring him to make another move. The leader gasped, pulling his arm close to his chest. He sat up shakily, his entire body trembling. One of his men stumbled forward. "Boss, you okay?" The leader didn't answer. He was too busy staring at Shadow. That's when one of the other bikers whispered the question they were all thinking. "What kind of dog is that?" Claire smiled again. "Shadow," she said casually. "Oh, he's just a retired Navy SEAL K9. Silence. Pure, absolute silence. It stretched between them, heavy and cold. The bikers' faces paled. Their bravado disappeared in an instant. They hadn't just picked the wrong person to mess with. They had picked the absolute worst. The leader's hands were still shaking as he struggled to his feet. His breathing was uneven, his body stiff. He looked down at his arm. It wasn't bleeding, but the deep indentations from Shadow's teeth were clear. That could have been worse. Much worse. He knew it. They all knew it. One of the men took a step back. We should go." The leader didn't argue. He didn't have anything left to say. Without another word, he turned, his boots dragging against the pavement as he stumbled toward his bike. The others followed, their movements quick and frantic. Then, the engines roared to life. Claire listened as the motorcycles sped off into the night, their once proud riders now nothing more than shadows disappearing into the distance. She exhaled slowly, her grip on Shadow's leash loosening. She knelt down beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "Good boy," she whispered. Shadow let out a small huff, wagging his tail just once before sitting beside her, his body finally relaxing. Claire smiled. The bikers weren't laughing anymore. And they wouldn't be coming back. The night air was still. The only sound left was the distant hum of engines fading away. Claire listened until the last echo disappeared. Only then did she truly relax. She knelt beside Shadow, her fingers brushing through his thick fur. His body, once tense and coiled like a spring, had now softened. His ears twitched, still listening, but she could feel that he knew the fight was over. "Good boy," she whispered again. Shadow huffed, his tail giving a slow wag. He had done his job. Claire took a deep breath and slowly stood. The scent of gasoline still lingered in the air, mixed with the faint staleness of cigarette smoke. The bikers had left, but their presence had tainted the quiet street. Not that it mattered now. They wouldn't come back. They wouldn't dare. Claire adjusted the strap on her grocery bag, making sure it was still secure. The weight in her hand was a small reminder of the normal task she had started before everything happened. Just a simple trip to the store. Now, it had turned into something else entirely. She smirked slightly to herself. Funny how life works sometimes. With a gentle tug on Shadow's leash, she spoke softly, "Let's go home, boy." Shadow fell into step beside her immediately, walking with the same steady, disciplined pace as always. As if nothing had happened. But something had happened. And Claire knew this moment would stay with those bikers forever. The walk home was quiet. The streets were mostly empty, the occasional sound of a distant car breaking the silence. Street lights hummed above, casting long shadows across the pavement. Claire's footsteps were steady. The rhythm of her shoes clicking against the ground matched Shadow's soft paw steps. She kept her ears open, listening carefully, making sure they weren't being followed. But she already knew the truth. They were gone. Completely. Cowards always ran when they realized they weren't in control. Claire had learned that a long time ago. As she walked, she replayed everything in her mind. The way the bikers had laughed, the way they had circled her, the way their leader had tried to intimidate her. And then, the way Shadow had ended it all in an instant. Claire smiled. Most people thought being blind made her vulnerable. Most people assumed she needed protection. But they never realized that she already had the best protection in the world. And tonight had proved it once again. She reached the steps of her small apartment building. The familiar creak of the wooden stairs welcomed her as she climbed up. Shadow's paws tapped lightly against the steps, always right beside her. She unlocked the door, stepping inside. The air smelled like home, like lavender and fresh linen. Safe. She placed her grocery bag on the counter, taking a moment to breathe. The weight of the night slowly settled in her chest. She wasn't scared. She wasn't shaken. But she was tired. Not physically, mentally. It was always the same. People saw her, assumed she was weak, assumed she needed help. They never saw what she was truly capable of. They never saw Shadow for what he really was. And if she was being honest, she preferred it that way. She knelt beside Shadow again, running her fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of him beneath her touch. He had saved her life tonight. Not just by protecting her, but by proving, once again, that she was never truly alone. "You're amazing, you know that," she whispered. Shadow huffed again, licking her hand once before lying down with a satisfied sigh. Claire chuckled softly. Yeah, you already know." She leaned back against the couch, letting her head rest for a moment. The city outside continued on, unaware of what had just happened. Unaware that, tonight, 5 men had learned a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, Claire woke up to the soft sound of birds outside her window. Sunlight warmed the room, painting golden patches across the floor. Shadow was already awake, sitting by the door, waiting. She smiled. "You ready for another day, boy?" Shadow wagged his tail. She stretched, feeling well rested despite the excitement of the night before. After getting dressed, she clipped Shadow's harness into place and grabbed her cane. It was just another normal day. Or at least, it should have been. She stepped outside and started her walk toward her favorite coffee shop. The air was fresh, the scent of blooming flowers drifting through the streets. She enjoyed these mornings. The peaceful ones. The ones where nothing unexpected happened. But as she walked past a group of people chatting on the sidewalk, she caught part of a conversation that made her pause. "Did you hear about those bikers last night?" "Yeah. I heard they ran out of town like scared little kids. They were talking about some dog. Said it took down their leader." Claire hid her smile. She kept walking. Let the rumors spread. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to prove anything. Because the truth was simple. Some people needed to see to believe. But Claire? She had never needed sight to know the strength that existed in the world. And now? Neither did they. The leader of the bikers groaned, lying on the pavement. His body was stiff, his breaths ragged. He clutched his arm, wincing from the pain. It wasn't broken, but the deep pressure from Shadow's jaws had left its mark. A reminder. A warning. His gang had abandoned him. One by one, they had run. Their heavy boots had scuffed against the ground as they scrambled away, their laughter gone. Their tough words forgotten. Now, it was just him. Alone. Vulnerable. He looked up at Claire, his chest rising and falling as he struggled to breathe. You set us up," he stammered, his voice weak. Claire tilted her head slightly, amusement flickering across her face. She knelt down, resting a gentle hand on Shadow's head. The dog sat beside her, calm but still alert. His sharp eyes stayed locked on the man. "No," Claire said softly, shaking her head. "You set yourself up." She heard the man's breath hitch. "You thought I was weak," she continued. "You thought I was easy." She could hear him shifting, trying to sit up straighter, trying to regain control of the situation. But there was no control left for him. Claire stood up, her posture tall and confident. She turned slightly, her ears picking up a new sound in the distance. Sirens. They were getting closer. A slow smile formed on her lips. "Next time," she said over her shoulder, her voice smooth. "Pick on someone your own size." The leader flinched at her words, his fingers curling into fists against the pavement. He didn't reply. He couldn't. The sirens wailed louder, echoing through the quiet streets. Flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of nearby buildings as the police cars skidded to a stop. Doors flew open. Heavy boots pounded the ground. "Stay where you are," a firm voice shouted. Claire didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She could hear everything: the urgency in the officer's voice, the swift movements of the men rushing toward the fallen leader. A pair of handcuffs clicked into place. The sharp snap of metal against wrists. "You got a report about a group causing trouble," one of the officers said. His voice was clipped, professional. "Looks like we found one of them." The leader didn't argue. Didn't try to run. Didn't even speak. Claire could feel the way the air had changed. He wasn't just beaten. He was broken. One of the officers stepped closer to her. "Miss, are you okay?" Claire turned her head toward the voice and gave a small nod. "I'm fine," she said. "Thanks to Shadow." The officer glanced down at the dog. Shadow sat perfectly still, watching everything with quiet focus. "Impressive," the officer muttered. Claire smiled. "Yeah. He is." The officer hesitated. "Do you need a ride home?" Claire shook her head. "No. I can handle it." She reached down, brushing her fingers against Shadow's soft fur. He wagged his tail slightly, as if understanding. The officer didn't push. Instead, he turned back to the leader, who was now being pulled to his feet. The man groaned again, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, he looked small. Weak. The way he had assumed Claire was. The irony made her smile. As she walked away, Shadow guiding her, she heard one last thing. A quiet murmur. One of the officers asking, What happened to you? And the broken voice of the leader replying, that dog. He's not normal. Claire kept walking. She didn't need to hear the rest. The night air was cool against her skin, but it felt warm inside her chest. Not because of victory. Not because she had won. But because justice had been served. Shadow walked beside her, steady and strong. He had done his job. And he would always do his job. Claire knew this wouldn't be the last time someone underestimated her. But that was okay. Because next time, she'd be ready. And Shadow? He always was. The city lights glowed softly, the hum of the streets returning to normal. Life went on. But for one man, for one gang, life would never be the same. They had learned a lesson. And they would never forget. Justice had been served. And Claire? She just kept walking, knowing that in the end, the strong always found their way. The leader groaned on the pavement, his breathing ragged. His arm throbbed where Shadow had gripped him, and his entire body ached from the sudden, hard fall. His vision was slightly blurry from the shock of being taken down so easily. He had thought this would be fun. An easy game. A little intimidation, a little power play over someone who couldn't even see him coming. But now he was the one on the ground. And his gang? They had run. Claire could hear their footsteps fading away, their boots scuffing the pavement as they disappeared into the night. They hadn't even tried to help him. Cowards. She tilted her head slightly as she listened to him struggle, trying to lift himself up. You set us up, he stammered, his voice shaky, weak. Claire let out a small, almost amused breath. She knelt beside Shadow, resting her fingers lightly against his fur. The dog was still standing tall, his posture relaxed yet completely in control. No, Claire said, shaking her head. You set yourself up. The leader swallowed hard. You thought I was weak, she continued, her voice even and steady. You thought I was easy. She heard him shift, his hands pressing against the pavement, trying to regain some sense of power. But it was too late for that. Claire stood, straightened her shoulders, and turned slightly toward the sound of approaching sirens. They were getting closer now, the high-pitched wail cutting through the quiet night. She smiled slightly. Next time, she said over her shoulder. Pick on someone your own size. The leader let out a weak, frustrated grunt, but he didn't say anything else. What could he say? Everything had changed in just a few minutes. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The red and blue lights flashed against the buildings as the police cars skidded to a stop. Doors flew open. Footsteps quick, purposeful. Stay where you are, a strong voice commanded. Claire stayed still, her hand resting calmly on Shadow's harness. She had nothing to run from. Nothing to hide. The officers moved fast, their heavy boots crunching against the pavement as they surrounded the man still lying on the ground. One of them leaned down, gripping the leader's arm and flipping him onto his stomach. The sharp click of handcuffs followed, the cold metal snapping around his wrists. You got a report about some guys causing trouble, one of the officers said, his voice clipped and professional. Guess we found one of them. The leader didn't fight back. Didn't argue. Didn't even move. Claire could hear the way he was breathing, could sense the quiet fear now settled deep in his chest. One of the officers turned to her. Miss, are you all right? She gave a small nod. I'm fine. The officer hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Shadow. The dog sat calmly, his tail resting against the pavement. He looked like any other guide dog, controlled, disciplined. But the officer had seen what just happened. He had seen Shadow move like a trained soldier. What kind of dog is that? The officer muttered under his breath. Claire smiled. Oh, Shadow, she said, tilting her head slightly. He's just a retired Navy SEAL K9. Silence. The officer exhaled sharply, a quiet breath of disbelief. Damn, he muttered. Another officer hauled the leader to his feet, gripping his arms firmly. What happened to you? One of the officers asked him. The leader, still shaken, still pale, licked his lips before muttering, that dog. He's not normal. Claire simply turned away. Let them figure it out. She heard the car doors open, heard the leader being pushed into the back seat of a police cruiser. The door slammed shut, the sound final. Justice was being served. She reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears. Let's go home, boy, she murmured. Shadow wagged his tail slightly, his energy still focused, still ready. But Claire knew he had done his job. And she had done hers. They started walking again, her steps light, relaxed. The tension of the night melted away, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. Underscore 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 on. The streets were empty as they made their way home. The cool night air brushed against Claire's skin, carrying the scent of fresh grass and damp pavement. The world had returned to normal. Or at least, it seemed that way. Claire's mind replayed everything: how fast Shadow had reacted, how quickly the bikers had crumbled. They had been so sure of themselves. So sure she was weak. But they had left knowing the truth. Claire was never weak. And Shadow? Shadow was unstoppable. She could still hear their shocked voices, their panicked footsteps as they ran. It was funny, in a way. People like them lived their lives trying to scare others. Trying to act like the strongest ones in the room. But when real strength faced them, they ran. Cowards always did. Claire reached her apartment building and climbed the steps, Shadow still at her side. She unlocked the door, stepping inside and inhaling the familiar scent of home. Safe. Quiet. She placed her grocery bag on the counter, shaking her head slightly. What a night. She knelt down beside Shadow, running her hands through his fur. He was warm, solid, strong. You know you're amazing, right? She whispered. Shadow huffed, his tail thumping lightly against the floor. Claire chuckled. Yeah. You already know. She stood, stretching out her arms. It had been a long day, but she felt lighter now. They had faced danger. And they had won. Again. She walked toward the window, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside. Somewhere in the distance, another motorcycle rumbled past. It wasn't them. They were long gone. And they wouldn't be coming back. Claire smiled. Because justice had been served. And if anyone else ever made the mistake of thinking she was weak, well, they'd learn the same lesson. The hard way. She turned away from the window, walking back toward the couch where Shadow had already curled up. She sat beside him, resting a hand against his back. For the first time that night, she truly relaxed. The world outside kept moving. But inside, in this moment, all was calm. All was safe. Shadow let out a slow, contented breath, his eyes finally closing. Claire leaned her head back, a peaceful smile on her lips. Tomorrow would be another day. Another walk. Another world of people who thought they knew who she was. But tonight? Tonight, she had nothing left to prove. And that was enough. Shadow shifted slightly in his sleep, his ears twitching even as he rested. Ever alert. Ever ready. Because no matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it. The police officers moved quickly, their hands firm as they locked the cold metal handcuffs around the gang leader's wrists. His arms were pulled behind his back, his body stiff with resistance. He wanted to fight, to break free, but he knew he couldn't. The power he thought he had just minutes ago had vanished. He had lost. And worse, he had lost to someone he had underestimated. Claire stood quietly, her hand resting on Shadow's head. She listened to the sharp clicks of the cuffs, the way the officer muttered something into his radio. The world around her had returned to normal, the hum of streetlights, the distant sound of cars rolling down the road. But something had changed. For the gang leader, for the people who had watched, for anyone who thought power came from being loud, from being seen, tonight was a lesson. A nearby onlooker, an older man standing by the entrance of a small shop, shook his head in disbelief. "Never judge a book by its cover," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Claire just smiled. Because she had heard those words before. She had spent her entire life proving them true. She had walked through the world with people assuming things about her. Assuming she was weak because she couldn't see. Assuming she needed help when she didn't. Assuming she was someone they could take advantage of. And every single time, they had been wrong. Shadow let out a quiet breath, his tail flicking slightly. He had known all along. He had never doubted her. Because sometimes, the most underestimated people are the ones you never see coming. The night was quiet again. The flashing police lights slowly dimmed as the officers drove away, taking the gang leader with them. The streets felt lighter, as if the air itself had changed. Claire took a deep breath. The world was full of people who judged others by what they could see. She had learned to live in a world she could not see. And in doing so, she had learned how to listen. How to sense the truth behind people's words, how to hear the fear in a bully's voice, how to know when danger was near. She had learned how to stand strong in a world that thought she needed someone else to stand for her. Shadow nudged her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. She smiled and ran her fingers through his fur. "Let's go home, boy," she said softly. Shadow wagged his tail and started walking beside her, his step steady and confident. She wasn't afraid. She never had been. She had Shadow. And together, they could face anything. The next morning, the town buzzed with whispers. People in the coffee shop spoke in hushed voices. "Did you hear what happened last night? They say a gang tried to mess with that blind woman. And they lost." The cashier, a young woman with bright eyes, shook her head in disbelief. "How?" An older man, the same one who had watched it all unfold, sipped his coffee and chuckled. "She had a dog." The young woman frowned. "A dog?" The man smiled. "Not just any dog." Claire walked into the shop, her steps even, her face calm. She heard the murmurs, the way conversations quieted for just a moment when she passed. She smiled. Let them talk. Let them wonder. She had nothing to prove. She ordered her coffee, just like she did every morning. She listened to the hum of the espresso machine, the soft clinking of cups against the counter. And when she turned to leave, she heard one last whisper. "I can't believe it. She doesn't even look dangerous." Claire chuckled to herself. Because that was the point. She never needed to look dangerous. She never needed to look strong. She just was. And Shadow? He always knew the truth. She walked outside, letting the warm sun touch her face. The air smelled like fresh coffee and blooming flowers. Another day. Another moment to remind the world that strength isn't always loud. That power isn't always seen. That the most underestimated people are often the ones who change everything. She took a deep breath, lifted her chin, and kept walking. Because the world belonged to those who dared to move forward. And Claire? She never stopped moving. The morning was crisp and fresh as Claire stepped out of her apartment, Shadow walking proudly beside her. The world had no idea what had happened last night. The streets looked the same. The air smelled the same. The town continued its usual rhythm, cars rolling by, people chatting on sidewalks, the occasional honk of a distant horn. But Claire knew. The gang had learned a lesson they would never forget. She smiled slightly, adjusting her grip on Shadow's leash. He was calm, as always, but she could feel his quiet pride. He knew what he had done. He knew he had protected her, just like he was trained to do. They walked together toward her favorite coffee shop, the small bell above the door chiming softly as she stepped inside. The moment she entered, she could hear the difference. The soft murmur of voices, the way conversation slowed down, the way people turned just slightly in her direction. They were talking about her. She had expected this. It was a small town, and news traveled fast. She walked to the counter, her step steady and confident. "Morning, Claire," the barista greeted, her voice a little too cheerful, a little too curious. "Morning, Lily," Claire replied, smiling. "The usual, please." The barista hesitated. Claire could hear it in the slight delay before she reached for the coffee cup. "So, Lily cleared her throat. "I heard something happened last night." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Lily leaned in slightly. "With you and some guys." Claire smiled knowingly. "People talk, huh?" Lily laughed nervously. "Are they right? Did you really take down a gang? Someone said you didn't even touch them, but somehow they all ran away like scared little kids." Claire chuckled softly. "I didn't take down anyone," she said simply. "Shadow did." Lily blinked. "Shadow?" Claire nodded, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "Yeah. He's special." Another customer, an older man sitting at the corner table, leaned in. "Not just special," he said. "I saw what happened. That dog of yours, he's something else." Claire turned her head slightly. She recognized the voice. He had been there last night, watching from a distance. "What exactly did you see?" she asked playfully. The man let out a small chuckle. "I saw 5 big guys, all loud and full of themselves, thinking they could scare you." He shook his head. "And then I saw them run. I saw them run like they had seen a ghost." Lily gasped. "No way." Claire just smiled. The man took a sip of his coffee before setting it down. "Never judge a book by its cover," he muttered. Claire nodded. "That's true." Lily still seemed in shock. "But, what did Shadow do?" Claire took her coffee, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "He did what he was trained to do." The older man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Trained?" Claire hesitated for just a second. Then, she smiled. "He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. Silence. Pure, absolute silence." Lily's mouth dropped open slightly. The man at the table let out a low whistle. "That explains a lot," he murmured. Claire took a sip of her coffee. The whispers in the shop grew louder. People who had been pretending not to listen were now fully engaged. A retired Navy SEAL K9? A guide dog who had once been a soldier? It was something out of a movie. And yet, it was real. Claire didn't mind the attention. She had spent her life being underestimated. If this changed the way people looked at her, at those like her, then maybe that wasn't a bad thing. She finished her coffee and placed the cup back on the counter. "Well," she said with a small smile, "I better get going." Lily was still staring. "You're just gonna walk out like that?" Claire laughed. "What else would I do?" Lily shook her head in disbelief. "You're amazing, Claire." Claire reached down, patting Shadow's side. "I just have a good partner." With that, she turned and walked out, Shadow guiding her effortlessly through the doorway. The whispers continued throughout town. At the grocery store, two cashiers talked in hushed voices. "Did you hear about Claire?" "Yeah. People say her dog took down a whole gang." "No way." "I swear. He used to be in the military." At the park, a group of teenagers sat on a bench, looking around as if expecting to see her. "You think she's dangerous?" "Nah, but that dog is." "Dude, she doesn't even look scary." "Yeah, and that's the point. That's what makes it so cool." Claire continued with her day, letting the stories spread. She didn't need to correct them. Let them talk. Let them wonder. The truth was simple. People had always judged her by what they could see. But real strength, real power? It was never just about what people could see. That evening, Claire sat on her couch, Shadow curled up beside her. The world outside had quieted, the city settling into the calm of the night. She ran her fingers through Shadow's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. She thought about the gang, about the leader's wide, terrified eyes as Shadow had taken him down. She thought about how quickly the bikers had run, how everything had changed in an instant. She thought about how many times in her life people had assumed she needed help, assumed she was weak, assumed she couldn't handle herself. They never saw the truth. But now, there were 5 men in town who knew better. And they wouldn't forget. Ever. She smiled to herself, leaning back against the couch. Because sometimes, the strongest people weren't the ones who looked strong. Sometimes, the most dangerous people were the ones no one ever saw coming. Shadow let out a slow breath, his body finally relaxing. Claire did the same. Tomorrow would be another day. Another chance for someone to underestimate her. And when they did, she would smile. Because they had no idea. And by the time they figured it out, it would be too late.